So good morning and welcome to our webinar to discuss the future of umbrella companies. Just a few introductions. We've got myself, Jared Mollison, I'm the sales director for Datum. We've also got with us Matt Fryer, who's the head of legal services for Brookson Legal. So just a bit of background on why would Datum run a webinar on umbrella companies? Well, our business is about helping companies who've got a large spend on agency labour to manage that spend. And as part of that, we also ensure that both the agencies and the agency workers are legally compliant. So we come across umbrella companies all the time. And we're also often asked what our opinion is of them and should they be part of the supply chain. You might have seen in the press recently a number of news articles. The biggest one was the BBC, who have highlighted the use of mini umbrella companies in particular, which were being used on the COVID testing stations, which were outsourced to third parties who were providing agency workers who were using mini umbrella schemes. Now, those schemes were using offshore directors to reduce the amount of tax they pay and essentially defraud the taxman. That was picked up by a number of other companies. So the Guardian picked that up as well. And then also the TUC have jumped on the back of that too. And they are essentially calling for an outright ban of all umbrella companies. What that's meant is that we've had a number of concerned phone calls from potential customers and existing customers who are asking us, is there a place for umbrella companies in the supply chain? They're very concerned about mini umbrella companies as well. So what we decided to do is team up with Brookson. Brookson are a company who've been known to us for quite a number of years. We very much see them as the good guys in the market. And what they're going to do on this webinar is talk to you about what is an umbrella company. They'll talk you through a mini umbrella company and what are the risks and the problems with those. And they'll also talk about the future of umbrella companies as well. So just before I do that, a couple of housekeeping things. We will be running a couple of polls on this webinar, and it'd be great if you could participate in that. We've also got a Q&A session toward the end. And I don't really expect this to last any more than an hour. So I hope you can join us to the end and I hope you find it of use. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to Matt.
Thanks, Jared, and good morning, everybody. My name's Matt Fryer. I'm the Group Compliance Director at Brookson. I've been working for Brookson for around 12 years now, and I think through the majority of that time, we've had a close working relationship with the guys at Datum. So happy to be invited onto the webinar and happy to share my thoughts around umbrella companies. But just an overview of Brookson. We are a business that supports contractors, essentially. We've been in the market for 25 years or so. We've got three main brands that are pointed towards contractors. Brookson One is a founding member of the FCSA, the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association. I'll talk through what that body does later on in the slides, but essentially it's a way of the market attempting to self-regulate itself in the absence of any formal government regulation. We're also ICAW registered accountants, and we have around 20,000 contractors who we support, whether it be through being their accountant, if they're working through their own limited company. And we also do have an umbrella company, which obviously is the focus for the webinar today. Also within the group, we've got Brookson Legal. I head up that division as well as managing compliance across the group. And as you imagine, we are IR35 specialists, so we've been very busy over the last 12, 18 months, helping the supply chain to prepare for and embed the new changes that obviously came in April 21. And the reason I think that the IR35 change is relevant is it's obviously triggered a resurgence in the use of umbrella companies. So I've also got a slide where we'll touch on the impact of IR35 changes and what things to think about if you've got contractors who are moving from PSC into umbrella. And finally, with it, we've got a financial services division that just helps to provide additional support, I guess, to contractors because they're not in full-time employment. They don't get the employee benefits such as pensions. So we try and help them through obviously monitoring workplace pensions, providing that to them, but also helping them with contractor-specific mortgages and investment products. So that's an overview of Brookson. This next slide, I just wanted to have a look at various pieces of legislation that have impacted the flexible labour market over the last 20 years or so. And there's been a lot of changes. I think HMRC in particular have had a real focus on the self-employed labour market because there have been pockets of non-compliance. And we can see here there's various pieces of legislation that they've brought in to try and address individual risks. And the IR35 change in April 21 just being the more recent one. And it feels like a bit of a whack-a-mole approach in that they see a pocket of non-compliance, they bring in some new rules to try and address it, and non-compliance pops up elsewhere. So I think government are still looking at the whole flexible labour market, and I think there will be further changes in the future. And you know, at the moment they're talking about making a statutory employment status test. They are talking about regulation of umbrellas. So I think it's obviously advisable to have a keen eye on compliance in this sector because there are more changes. But I think, you know, a welcome insight on this graph is you can see that despite the legislation changes, there is still significant growth. Obviously, the impact of COVID we can see there from 2020, but the number of self-employed and freelancers in the UK labour market is significant now. I think 16% of the total workforce work in a flexible way, and it's growing. So I think we need to recognise that. And it's interesting, I just wanted to put that into context when we start thinking about the role that umbrella companies have got to play in this flexible labour market. So perhaps we're starting with a bit of an overview of what an umbrella company is and why it exists. Essentially, an umbrella company is a company that employs contractors and provides their services typically into a recruiter who then provides it into an end hirer. So you'll think the way that you acquire your temporary workers, you'll have a need in your business for a temporary worker. You'll approach an agency or an agency supply chain or an RPO to manage that for you, and you'll go and look for that contractor. Once a contractor has been found, they then need to figure out how they will be paid, because clearly one of the reasons you've gone for a contractor is you don't want to employ them directly yourselves. So there's various options in which that can happen. One is the agency could put them on their payroll. Some agencies are happy to do that. Some agencies don't run a payroll. The other option is for the individual to work through their own limited company or as a PSC, a personal service company. That is typically suitable for more experienced contractors, and specifically now for contractors who are working on an assignment that is outside of IR35. So that used to be a very popular choice, perhaps less popular at the moment, while I think the market's still getting its head around IR35, but still a viable option. And the third option is an umbrella company. So this really is suitable for contractors whose roles fall inside IR35, or contractors who are working outside IR35 but are new to contracting and don't want the hassle and the commitment of setting up their own limited company, buying their own insurance, appointing an accountant and dealing with the director responsibilities and obligations that come with that. So it's quite a hassle-free way for a contract to work. And you can see the benefits here. It provides continuous employment for contractors who are taking a series of short-term assignments. They maintain one employment relationship with one employer, the umbrella company. Even if they're finding roles through multiple agencies, it means that the tax code isn't continuously changing. It means they can start to get consistency of employment to help them with mortgage applications and other finances. And the more established umbrella companies now are offering enhanced benefits to their employees. Obviously, work-based pension scheme they have to offer, but some are offering more advanced salary sacrifice pensions and other group group discount schemes for their employees as well. So that there's the benefits to the worker. Obviously, to the supply chain, it allows you as the end hirer, and it also allows the agencies as well to outsource their employment risk. So the umbrella company takes on the obligations of sick pay, of ensuring holiday pay is provided and processed correctly, processing payroll correctly, paying taxes over to HMRC, administering pensions. So the umbrella takes on all of that employment risk and compliance burden, if you like. So if you have compliant umbrella companies in your supply chain, they can help you to manage your risk. They can help the supply chain to manage the risk, and hopefully they're offering a good experience to the contractor. So that's what good looks like, and that's why umbrellas are here. The way it works, as I've alluded to earlier, the umbrella company employs the individual. So there's an employment contract in place, and the umbrella company picks up the offering of the employment rights and benefits. The payment that the umbrella company will receive will come from the agency, if you use an agency to source labour, or in some instances, there are a small number of end hirers who are now starting to directly engage with umbrella companies if they've got any directly employed contractors. It is quite rare though. Typically an agency will be in place. But the agency will pay the umbrella company, and from that payment, the umbrella company pays its employers costs, which is typically the employer's national insurance and the apprenticeship levy. And then they'll be left with a pot of money from which they'll take a small margin, typically between £15 to £25 a week. And the rest will be available to pay to the worker as their salary, obviously with deduction of employee national insurance and pay as you earn. So if you think about the supply chain, you've got you as the end hirer, you've got an agency that's providing you with a worker, you've then got the umbrella company, and then the worker at the end of that supply chain. So what you're looking for there is a UK-based company that employs individuals and pays them subject to pay as you earn. So that's an overview of what umbrella companies are and why they exist. And just move on to the next slide, where we're having a look at, I think we've got a poll, haven't we, Char? Yeah.
Yeah, we have. Sorry, that's me. We need to do a poll. So hopefully you can all take part in that. So it looks like at the moment, more than half of the participants on the call do have umbrella companies in their supply chain. Some of them don't know. Okay, hopefully you can see the results of those. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide now, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, interesting results there. I think, yeah, I would expect half, if not more, to have umbrella companies in the supply chain. I think those of you that aren't sure, I think when we go through the slide deck, it might sort of trigger you to want to have a look at that and maybe explore if you have and who they are. But we'll move through the slides, just looking at some key compliance areas, and then we'll take a look in further detail at some of the risk that could come from umbrella companies. So I've covered a lot of this in the previous slide, but I think it's key to understand the types of things that you could check, or certainly you can be outsourcing that check into your supply chain. So we want to make sure that the umbrella company is a UK registered company. And the reason I say that is there's no reason at all for it to be based outside the UK. If it is, in my mind, is that because it's trying to sort of hide things from HMRC and do things not in a non-compliant way. So compliant umbrella company will be UK registered company, and it will be VAT registered in the UK as well. It will typically hold, or it will hold insurances, employers, employees and public liability insurance. So if that temporary worker or contractor does anything significantly wrong that results in additional costs, you would ultimately expect that umbrella company to carry insurance to allow for recompense if something something went wrong. And a key point as well is you're looking for an umbrella company that has got a robust trading history and financials. There's lots of umbrella companies that have sprung up in the last 12, 18 months, obviously trying to jump on the bandwagon of the IR35 changes resulted in more contractors needing to be employed by somebody. So there are lots of new providers in the market. And clearly what you don't want to happen is for an individual to do some work for you, the umbrella company to be paid for that work, and for it to go under and the funds not find the way to the worker. So you do need to be looking at the financials, make sure they are in a healthy state. We then look at worker payment. So typically the umbrella companies will pay the worker when they are paid by the agency. Obviously funding is provided by agencies, so it typically is a week by week. You get a worker do some work, and then the following Friday they get paid for that. Some of the larger umbrella companies, if there's been an issue with a timesheet or an invoice hasn't quite hit in time, they will typically offer advances to help try and bridge that gap. But again, back to that point around making sure they've got a robust trading history. You want to make sure that they're not going to go pop or win some workers some money. A key point here, and this is where some confusion comes from the workers, the umbrella company's employees' salaries calculated after the umbrella deducts its employer costs. I mentioned that on the previous slide. Now, those employer costs are wrapped up in the rate which has been agreed with the contractor for them to do their services. So it's really important, and we touch on this in the worker engagement section, that the umbrella company and also the agency and supply chain are transparent with the umbrella worker that the rate they have agreed is the rate that gets paid to the umbrella company. And then after deduction of employer costs, the gross salary to the worker is calculated. And that has been a big issue in the market. There's some new rules came in a couple of years ago where the supply chain has got to issue a key information document to all contractors. And that document will spell out that point around the rate you've agreed isn't necessarily your gross salary, because the supply chain has got some costs in that it needs to pay over to HMRC before it works out your pay. So there should be clear engagement with the worker and the umbrella company to explain how the pay works. For someone new to umbrella company working, it is difficult to get the head around. So you're looking for umbrellas that have got a real good onboarding process and can issue illustrations for pay. It just makes sure there's no confusion further down the line. And when the worker gets paid, they'll get a pay slip, but that pay slip will be accompanied by what we call a pay reconciliation, which should take them right back to the pay rate that they've agreed. So I think, even with a fully compliant umbrella company, in my mind, that is the big issue for people new to umbrellas to get their head around how that pay calculation works. So you'd expect the umbrella to be explaining that. And then a summary of risks, and we'll touch on some specifics later on. Obviously, non-payment of the worker we've talked about. HMRC are concerned about VAT fraud and pay-as-you-earn avoidance by some of the non-compliant umbrella companies. And there are some quite complex tax avoidance schemes out there that call themselves umbrellas, but actually they're trying to operate a complex tax avoidance scheme. So if we just move on to the next slide, we'll look at some of those risks in a bit more detail. I think Jared mentioned this earlier on, mini umbrella companies. These have been around for a number of years, and the way that they work is they will only employ 2 or 3 contractors in them. And that means that the turnover of each individual mini umbrella company doesn't breach certain thresholds that allow them to benefit from some tax advantages that are aimed at small one-man companies. And the main 2 are, there's a £3,000, or I think it's recently dropped to £2,000 a year employers allowance for national insurance that small businesses qualify for. And there's a slightly lower rate of VAT under the flat rate VAT scheme that small businesses can qualify for. So the mini umbrella companies try to make sure that their turnover doesn't exceed the thresholds that would preclude them from benefiting from the NI and the VAT savings. And they clearly claim the NI and the VAT savings, and they pocket the difference. It very rarely finds its way to the worker. It very rarely finds its way back up the supply chain, although some of them do offer quite hefty incentives to agencies to refer business to them. Now, the problem with that is as soon as you've got a number of these mini umbrella companies under the same control, HMRC group all of them together and you're looking at the total gross turnover, which then breaches the threshold for some of these tax benefits. And HMRC are very clear about that, and they view a mini umbrella company as tax fraud. The providers probably acknowledge that it's tax fraud because they're based outside the UK, often in jurisdictions where HMRC can't find them and can't enforce any action against them. For some reason, the Philippines seems to be a very popular destination for these mini umbrella companies. Now, the reason that they're outside the UK is so they can run away from the risk, but that risk can find its way back up the supply chain, ultimately to the end client. And the relevant piece of legislation to be aware of here is the Criminal Finance Act. That came in 4 years ago, and this is part of trying to tackle international tax fraud. I don't know if any of you recall the Panama Papers, sort of 7 or 8 years ago, which sort of lifted the lid on international tax fraud. And the Criminal Finance Act was brought in to try and tackle this. And it essentially says that as an end user of services, so as the end client, you have to have procedures in your business to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion. So you should have a policy in your business to tackle Criminal Finance Act. And part of that policy should be to be reviewing your supply chain and where you think there could be areas of risk to do extra due diligence and checking on the supply chain. HMRC are in the process of enforcing the Criminal Finance Act, and we know that the recruitment sector is a sector that they're focusing on. So it's not just umbrella companies, but any risk in that recruitment supply chain, you should have a process to be identifying, eliminating and managing that risk. And it's fine to outsource it. And I guess that's what the guys at Datum are supporting you with. But it's just to highlight the importance of that and how it applies to umbrella companies. So that's the big topical risk at the moment. Offshore loan schemes is the other one. Again, typically they look like they're based in the UK. So it will look like when you do your initial checks, you're dealing with a UK company, but they then make on payments to an offshore entity. And that offshore entity will then pay the worker through a mix of salary and a loan. So there will be an employment contract in place, but it'll typically only pay national minimum wage. And then any balancing funds owed to the employee will be paid via a loan. Now, to me, it seems quite obvious this. By definition, a loan needs to be repaid at some point. And that's why there's no tax on a loan, because there's no transfer of value. I loan you some money, you owe me the money back, the net transfer is zero. But clearly what happens here is that loan is actually never paid back, and ultimately it's written off. And at the point it's written off, that's when tax should be paid, but it never is due to the passage of time. So these were very common sort of 5 to 10 years ago. HMRC have spent quite a lot of time closing them down. And the problem they've had with it is they haven't sort of punished the promoters of the schemes because they're based offshore, they can't find them. What they have done is gone after the individual contractors. You may have heard of this in the business, or you may have read about it, that there are, unfortunately, there's been suicides over this. There's contractors who owe HMRC hundreds of thousands of pounds. So this one is, you don't want offshore loan schemes in your supply chain, A, because they might bring you risk, but B, they might be bringing unexpected risk to the people that have worked for your business. So there's a real reputation issue with this one. HMRC are trying to clamp down on them. But the phrase I mentioned before, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. Someone will come up with a slightly different version of the scheme in a slightly different jurisdiction, make a quick buck and disappear, and HMRC can't pursue them. So it's really important that you look beyond any business trying to purport to be trading in the UK. As soon as you pick under that, if you see there's any offshore involvement, that should be raising the red flag. Just go back one, sorry, Jared. I just wanted to touch on the green box there. We've talked about illustrations before and the importance of those, but we have seen, I call them ambulance chasers, we have seen law firms in the market who are looking to get contractors to sign up with them so they can make a claim for unpaid holiday pay, or make a claim that the employer's national insurance that umbrella companies have withheld from the pay rate is an illegal deduction from wages. So as the umbrella market is growing, there's a market of people trying to make money out of that umbrella market by suing them. Now, we've looked at this closely, and unless you have severely messed up your contracts and really aren't offering an umbrella company, but are offering something slightly different that doesn't work compliantly, there's no basis for a claim. And what's interesting is these businesses are charging upwards of £200 for individuals just to register with them. Now, even back in the PPI days, you wouldn't pay a solicitor on the off chance that they might get some funds for you. You would pay a percentage of whatever they win on your behalf. I think the fact that these guys are charging for registrations, I think they're in the market to make a quick buck. But I just wanted to flag that. I don't think there's any serious risk, but it did seem to be gathering a bit of momentum a month or so ago. It's one just to be aware of. But again, if you've audited your umbrellas and you've got a compliant supply chain of trusted providers, that shouldn't cause you an issue.
Right, we've got another poll. So the question is, I'll launch it to you. Do you have a process to ensure umbrella companies operating within your supply chain do not expose you to risk? So just give you a little moment to answer that, and then I'll share the results as I did the last time. Okay, just a couple more seconds for anybody who wants to take part in that poll. Okay. So interesting, half of the people don't have any procedures to ensure there's risk. Is that pretty much as you'd expect, Matt?
Yeah, it's not uncommon. I think people maybe you don't realise you are. I wouldn't be panicking, the 50% that are saying no, I wouldn't be panicking thinking I've got to go off and do lots of work. I think it's maybe just an issue to be flagging within your business that you need to have an eye on umbrella companies. And quite often the easy answer is to look to your supply chain, because they quite often will have done those checks and balances on your behalf. But yeah, it's not uncommon to see that.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll just stop that and then we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, great. I don't want to turn this into a webinar on IR35 changes, because I'm sure everyone's sort of breathed a sigh of relief on that one now. I've gone through April, but it did have an impact. So in case you aren't familiar or you've forgotten, obviously in April 21, you guys as the end client, as the end user of that contract labour, are now responsible for determining the employment status for all of your off-payroll workers. And in doing so, you need to produce a status determination statement, pass it down the supply chain, and then the supply chain is responsible for ensuring that the correct tax is paid. So if the IR35 output was outside of IR35, then contractors can continue having a choice in the payment method they want to work through, and PSC limited company is still an option for them. If, however, you've concluded that the contract they're working on is inside IR35, then whichever business pays that contractor needs to make sure that the correct tax and national insurance is being deducted. So you may have experienced workers in your business moving from PSCs into agency payroll or umbrella, and certainly any future roles after April, if they're inside IR35, there's a high likelihood that they will be engaged through an umbrella company. Now, you may know this, you may not know this, but obviously IR35 has driven a significant rise in the use of umbrella companies across the market. And, umbrella companies are probably the best way to manage that change. You don't want to be employing inside IR35 workers on your own payroll. That's the reason you've gone for a temporary worker or a contractor. And quite often agencies either don't have a payroll or aren't willing to invest in scaling that up. And let's remember as well that the contractors have got a choice in this matter. Some of them would rather work through an umbrella company than on an agency payroll for some of the reasons that I explained earlier around the benefits that come with that. So there's been a boom in umbrella companies across the market, which has obviously resulted in an increased spotlight on the umbrella industry. And there's been quite a lot of noise in the market around, is it the right answer? Is there something else that can be used? Obviously, we had the TUC recently saying they should be banned. And it's a little bit disappointing for me because the majority of the market is compliant. There's some big umbrellas that have been in the market for years and never had an issue. They stay on pulse with legislation changes and they support the supply chain. There are, like any other industry though, some bad apples in there. And it's just a shame that they've tainted the whole market. But I just wanted to touch on a few issues to consider. If you have lots of contractors in your business that are inside IR35, it's likely they're working through an umbrella company, whereas previously they might have been working through a personal service company. And so there's some issues that come with that I just wanted to highlight to you because it may have manifested itself in worker queries, worker complaints, and ultimately it's the reason why some of them are probably minded to challenge the IR35 outcome. So AWR is the first issue. So AWR is the agency workers regulations, and essentially they're in place to make sure that temporary workers receive similar pay and benefits to permanent staff, so they can't be exploited from a pay and benefits perspective. Now, when individuals are working through a personal service company, they're classified as self-employed, and AWR doesn't apply to them. Now they're in an employed model through an umbrella company, AWR does apply. So at a real high level, that means that there should be some checks and balances that have happened in the supply chain to make sure that that umbrella employee is being paid a similar rate to that of a permanent employee. Now, this right kicks in after 12 weeks of work. And again, that should be something that your agency supply chain is managing. But instances, it may result in instances where you may have to increase the pay after 12 weeks. So that's an issue to consider. It shouldn't happen because in the majority of cases, contractors working through a PSC are likely to be the higher paid, higher skilled contractors who are already being paid at a decent amount, probably in excess of what a perm equivalent would be. But it's one that I always flag, and it's one just to make sure that it's being managed correctly. The employer's national insurance, this is the big impacts of the IR35 changes. So if you take a contractor who is, say, on £600 a day, so £3,000 a week, if they were working through their own limited company outside of IR35, they'd probably be paying 20% tax all in all. So their take home would be £2,400 of that 3,000. Now they're working through an umbrella company. Obviously, from that £3,000, we've now got the employer's national insurance, apprenticeship levy, and employees' NICs. So you're looking at a tax rate of, in some instances, in excess of 50%. So the take-home pay roughly will be about 1,500 quid. So they've lost £900 a week as a result, potentially, of that IR35 decision. So again, that is the trigger why they may have challenged the IR35 outcome. They may have come to you or the supply chain and said, I want a pay increase. They may have found a role somewhere else. So, that tax differential is quite significant. And that applies whether they're working through agency payroll or umbrella companies. And it stems back to a contractor who predominantly has worked outside IR35 previously, now inside. They've got a significant pay drop to deal with, and they probably feel like they're being forced to use an umbrella company to benefit from that significant pay drop. So you can understand why cohorts of the market and some contractors are anti-umbrella and are trying to get IR35 statuses overturned. But back to, if you've got an experienced, established umbrella company in your supply chain, they should be able to explain all of that to the employee and help try and retain them, and help try and settle them down a little bit. The other fact to consider is the impact of expenses. So again, an outside IR35 contractor working through a PSC can pretty much claim tax relief on pretty much everything that they spend in relation to their work, including travelling to and from the work site, any food they buy, clearly any equipment. They can claim tax relief on all those expenses. In umbrella companies, it's very restrictive now in terms of the expenses that you can provide to your employees. There used to be a whole host of expenses, but the rules changed 3 or 4 years ago. And basically the only expenses that they are allowed are those that employees would get, full-time permanent employees. So the main difference there is they can't claim travel to and from the work site anymore. Still some expenses they can claim, but again, the impact of IR35 has been that some contractors that travel long distances to work, and obviously there's travel costs and accommodation costs and food and drink costs, they may have been used to claiming tax relief on that in the past, so are happy to pay it out of the contract rate. Now they can't claim tax relief on it. We've seen instances where contractors going back to the client and saying, I either want a rate increase or I want you to start paying me an expense allowance. So that may be something you've started to see over the last few months. And again, it's probably been triggered by that IR35 change. And again, supply chain compliance is crucial here. There are debt transfer rules in the IR35 legislation that means if that status determination statement that you've produced that gives the IR35 employment status isn't passed on correctly down the supply chain to the correct people, then tax liability can sit with somebody who perhaps doesn't realise that it sits with them. If they go bust owing the HMRC some tax, that liability can find its way back to you as the end client. So again, supply chain compliance, visibility of umbrellas in your supply chain, a process to make sure the SDS is passed correctly from party to party, and an ability for you to check or get comfortable that whoever is paying the individual is deducting the correct amount of tax and national insurance. They're all things that should form part of your IR35 response. Obviously, making the IR35 determination is the big challenge that everyone's had, but we're now starting to see businesses audit supply chains, get more interested in what's going on down the bottom of that supply chain. And clearly you don't have to be doing all that yourself. Again, it's back to using providers in your supply chain to help you monitor, review, and check that everything's in order from an IR35 compliance perspective. So final slide to touch on is where do we think umbrella companies will go? Well, as I said, they've been around for upwards of 20 years now, but they've always had a good role to play in the market, and HMRC accept that umbrella companies have got a role to play. If you look at the umbrella industry, it probably is the largest collector of tax for HMRC out of any other sector. There's upwards of 500 umbrella companies in the market, and between them, they are employing millions and millions of employees. And on a weekly basis, they're paying a significant amount of funds over to the Treasury. So umbrella companies are recognised by HMRC. Obviously, HMRC are trying to clamp down on non-compliance, but they do view them as a compliant, sustainable model. Mentioned the market is growing. Lots of providers in the market, and it feels to me like it's ripe for consolidation. Umbrellas work better where there's volume. Systems and processes can be aligned. So we see it in the US. In the US, you've got the PEO model, which is slightly different to umbrella companies in that it employs a lot of permanent staff, but also temporary staff. And the reason that model exists in the US is to access discount on healthcare provision. Obviously, no NHS over there. So the more people, the more employees you can have in a business, the cheaper the private healthcare comes. So you have professional employment organisations in the US that employ tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals, and essentially lease them or provide them back to the end client. So that's an interesting model, and we're starting to see some of the US PEO providers start to open offices, start to buy businesses that are based in the UK. So that'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. And in my mind, at the moment, you've got the contractor paying £15 to £20 a week to be payrolled and employed by a business. Could that flip on its head? So could it move to a situation where the agency or the end hirer is charged a fee for somebody managing the employment and payroll of its temporary or entire workforce? I think we're a while off, but that's certainly something to keep an eye on. So a growing market, could be consolidation, could be new models entering into it. Probably doesn't excite you very much, but quite exciting times ahead for the sector, I think. Government, as I mentioned, they accept umbrella companies. However, they recognise non-compliance, and umbrella regulation has been on the agenda for 4 years now. Matthew Taylor did a review of the gig economy back in 2017. There was multiple findings coming out of that, and one of them was regulation of umbrella companies. He recognised they play an important role in the sector. He recognised there's lots of them employing lots of people, but there's no central body that governs and regulates what they do. So that was fed back to government 4 years ago. They've done very little to progress that until recently. They now have put together a single enforcement body that will enforce umbrella companies as well as agencies, as well as other businesses that operate in that flexible labour market. So that has just been created. Via FCSA, we've been working with government, and they still aren't past the point of defining what an umbrella company is. They're really struggling to define what it is. And obviously you can't regulate something until you've got a very clear definition of what it is. So they're still at the starting blocks. So we think they'll get there, but I still think it's going to be a number of years away before government has got a single body regulating umbrella companies. But that aside, they still are regulating. So HMRC regulate all businesses for tax compliance. So there is some regulation in place there. I think it's just pulling it all together into one central enforcement body. I think that's a good thing. It would have been better if it would have happened in advance of April 21, and we had a central regulatory body in place now to take us through the I-35 change, but they just haven't acted quickly enough. So that's certainly another thing to keep an eye on. In the meantime, there are accreditation marks out there in the market at the moment. And this is compliant providers in the sector trying to self-regulate, trying to raise standards, trying to promote best practice. The FCSA is one, the Freelancer Contractor Services Association. Professional Passport is another, an APSCO, which is a trade body that recruitment businesses can sign up to, also do some compliance checks on umbrella companies. So there are some accreditations out there. I'd be looking for umbrella companies to be members of at least one of those organisations. That proves somebody externally has checked them. But even if you've got that in place, I would still recommend that you're doing your own due diligence checks, or certainly getting someone to be doing those on your behalf. So I think, in summary, I disagree with the TUC that umbrella companies could be banned, but I agree with the sentiment that there are some out there that aren't treating workers fairly and are trying to avoid taxes. So I think standards can be improved, and until we get government regulation, I think it's down to us collectively as supply chains to make sure we're doing everything we can to make you guys feel comfortable that you've got compliant umbrellas in there. And that's it for me. Hand back to Jared.
Yeah, brilliant. Don't go away yet, Matt. But thanks for that. I thought that was really useful. It was really interesting, even for somebody who sort of think that they know about the sector already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up to Q&A at the moment. So anybody who's got any questions, there is within Zoom, there's a Q&A box there. If you want to type your questions into that, I'll read them out. And in the meantime, I've got a bit of a question for you, Matt, actually. So what would you say to those people who say that agencies should just have their own payroll, and that, you know, you're just taking 15 to 20 pounds a week out of the agency workers' pockets?
Yeah, for me, this is choice. So within, certainly within Brookson Group, we offer umbrella company and PSC, and we also, for smaller agencies, offer support for back office. So as a business, we're somewhat ambivalent, but we were a business founded by contractors, and we want to make sure that contractors have got choice. And umbrella companies historically have been chosen by contractors to work, because it gives them that continuity of employment, and it's something that's easily dismissed. But if you are a job in agency temp, or a contractor that works for multiple agencies over the course of a year, every time you start a new job, you get put on an emergency tax code.
Yeah.
And you know, it might seem surprising, but just having that consistency in tax code, making sure that you don't have to wait to the year end to get emergency tax back, that's a big driver. And obviously an agency wouldn't want to keep a candidate on their payroll if the agency isn't supplying that candidate into a client. It just doesn't work that way. So, you know, that's one option. Again, if you think about agencies, at the heart of what agencies do is finding and placing candidates. There's been layers and layers of compliance built into that sector over the years. Some of the big ones can afford and have reacted and will manage it adequately themselves. Others, they just don't see it as their bag and they want to outsource it to somebody. So that's, you know, there's a role there for umbrella companies as well. And I think the industry has recognised it needs to do more. So umbrella companies historically didn't offer any enhanced pension schemes. The big ones now have got salary sacrifice available to their contractors. And actually that's brilliant tax planning. And it means they're getting better returns than just Nest. And also they're looking at enhanced benefits such as, you know, payment for jury service, just high street discount membership schemes. So it's trying to build that package to give extra value. The margins, what I would say though, is margins are very low to manage all of that compliance, to make sure you are not, you know, holiday pay is done correctly, pay as you earn is done correctly, they're onboarded correctly, queries are dealt with, timesheets are dealt with, invoices are raised correctly. Margins in umbrella world is very tight.
Yeah.
And that gives me an insight into the additional cost and work that agencies would have to do this correctly.
Exactly. So presumably if they had to take on board a whole payroll team, then to run all of this, they would need to increase their margin to the client as well. Yeah. Or take money off the worker, or, you know, not pass as much onto the worker anyway. So it nets itself out.
It does. And I think that the way that the payment is taken, the margin is retained by the umbrella company before the worker is paid.
Yeah. So
if it's a £20 margin, the net impact on their take-home pay is between £9 and £10.
Yeah.
It's obviously taken before tax is hit. And, you know, it's about transparency and being upfront with the individual that there is a fee to this, but these are the benefits. And once you have that frank discussion, most of them acknowledge that that's fine. Gets me to take the role, gets me paid regularly and accurately. I can see the benefits. It's £9 a week, not normally an issue.
Yeah. And obviously the impact of that £9 net is going to be more to somebody who's on a lower rate of pay than the higher. Is there a point where it's not relevant, or does it work all the way down to minimum wage?
Yeah, I think so. Technically, we've got to remember that the employer costs are laid on top of the rate. So I think we're at around £11.50, something like that. £11.50 is the minimum pay rate by which umbrella works, because once you've deducted all of your employer costs, you are getting down to national minimum wage.
Yeah.
As a business, our general rule of thumb is we're £15 an hour or above would seem sensible and justifiable, because you almost moving out of agency temp into lower paid contractor.
Yeah.
And they're the types of people who at some point, if they're comfortable working that way, would want to explore a limited company, obviously subject to IR35. So I'd say 1150 below, umbrella's not really suitable. That bit up to £15, questionable. £15 or above, definitely there's an appetite for it.
Good. Okay, so no more questions have come through. Thanks again, Matt. I really appreciate that.